And lately, I've been more interested in the development of situations like large, complex interorganizational networks, uh, problems which have large scale, uh, rapid intensification, and a lot of uncertainty. And I'm basically at the point where now I question even the application of the term reliability. I think we need to think through our performance standards very carefully. And so I've gotten involved in looking at this whole question about what are sensible performance standards in the face of problems and frameworks for problem solving that have changed rapidly.
Great. Yesterday, Paul, you were a glass half full guy. It sounds like today you ended up being a glass half empty guy.
Yeah, I'd be happy if it were half empty.
Okay, all right. Let's see, Corey, you are next on my list.
Oh, good afternoon. My name is Corey Pitzer. I am the CEO of a company called SafeMap, and we consult in the field of safety and risk. My specific interest in the field is that we have actually been in the past 4 years now actively created a high reliability organization system, if I can call it that, for a client in Namibia, a client that mines diamonds off the seabed with massive ships sitting on the surface and sucking up the diamonds from the seabed. And so it's a high risk environment, helicopters flying in, production facilities going on, even pirates. So it is a real opportunity to create this kind of, and we call this rapid risk response in terms of dealing with dynamic risks in the organization. And so I've been always very interested in this center's work. And especially the field of that I saw today about the sociology aspect. I'm a psychologist by training, but I do feel that the sociologists have better understanding of what goes on in an organization, and hence my interest in it.
Great, thank you. Next, Andres.
Good afternoon, Andres Acevedo. I am with the Santa Clara Valley Water District down here in San Jose, and working in our Office of Emergency Services. I've attended some of these meetings several years ago, pre-COVID, and just interested in this and really interested on a personal level in looking at organizational failures and what lessons we can learn from that. And just apology, at 3 o'clock, I'm going to have to jump off for another meeting, but tend to enjoy this. Thanks.
Great, thanks for joining. Next, we have Anna.
My name is Anna Serralibet. I'm affiliated at the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management, and I'm currently teaching 2 courses related to flood risk management and disasters at UC Berkeley. And I'm also working on different projects related to disasters and especially flood risk management. So that's my main interest, and very happy to be here today.
Great, thanks for joining us. I'll probably see you at a soccer pickup later on today. Emery.
My name's Emery Rowe, and I'd like to thank Jan for giving this presentation. Hi, Jan, it's good to see you again. Moved from looking at issues of high reliability management with Paul Schulman into issues of interconnected critical infrastructures, and obviously the challenge not just to reliability, but to safety and so on. And now with Paul also moving into a really interesting area for both of us is error avoidance, and a paradox, how error avoidance becomes more manageable, or at least more visible under conditions of high interconnectivity. Certain conditions. So it's good to end a career on looking at where we started out with an error avoidance.
Great, thank you, Emery. Heather. Oh, I see there's a chat. Chat says, hello, I'm Heather Iger, and forgive me, but I'm under the weather. Oh no, I lost the chat. I gotta click it open again here. Under the weather and lost my voice. I'm an analyst with the San Francisco Department of Emergency Management and Bay Area Urban Areas Security Initiative. Thanks for joining us today, Heather. I gotta close chat because it blocks my list. Joe. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, Joe Myers. I'm with AVS Group in Washington, D.C. We are part of the American Bureau of Shipping, which is the U.S. classification society for commercial shipping vessels. We do a lot of risk assessment, risk management consulting in a variety of industries, including marine and offshore, oil, gas, and chemical, power, energy, and my client base is primarily federal agencies such as Coast Guard, Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security.
Great, thanks for joining today. John, welcome, John.
Hi, Ruin. Thanks. My name is John Breslin. I'm an engineer with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and I've done some inspections of dams owned by PG&E, and we're always interested in risk and reliability. So looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Great, welcome, welcome. John Carroll.
Thanks. Tough when you've got a two John place.
We got two Johns.
Yeah, that's luxury. John Carroll, I'm at the MIT Sloan School of Management, longstanding interest in safety regarding nuclear power, hospitals, and other industries, and with a particular interest in organizational learning and improvement.
Great, welcome. Carolyn.
Hi, oops. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I think you can hear me. Yeah?
Yep, loud and clear.
Great. Thank you very much. Happy to be here. My name's Carolyn. I work currently, I was with Coast Guard for 15 years. So really focused on maintaining high reliability, did a lot of work and research in incident command, high reliability, and developing crisis management and crisis leadership in complex, adaptive, changing, high intensity environments. And currently I've been shifted over to Parks Canada, where I'm working with wildland firefighters and other visitor safety to help strengthen the cultural approach, but also I also work right down in the weeds with folks. So really happy to be here. Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thanks for joining us. Next on the list, we have Nick. Welcome back, Nick. We're not hearing you. I see your lips moving. No. No. It's always something. Technology can't go perfect. Nick, I'm going to cycle back to you at the end, if that's all right. I have an RR Payne.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, hey, good. Yeah, I'm a senior safety engineer with a defense contractor, and have studied a lot of safety stuff, and looking forward to hearing about how lying becomes entrenched in safety behavior.
Cool, yes. Betsy. Welcome, Betsy.
Hi. I'm not really sure what I'm answering here, but I'm gathering from contextual details that it's me.
Yes,
I'm
just a quick intro.
Okay, I'm an industrial hygienist. I'm an associate researcher here at UC Berkeley, and I'm the director of the Industrial Hygiene Graduate Training Program. And as a result, of course, I'm interested in safety culture and what kinds of things happen under what types of safety cultures.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. Jackson, yeah. Welcome, Jackson.
Hello there. I'm a professor at Olin Business School and Washington University, and I study system safety, so to speak, industrial catastrophes.
Great. Welcome. How about Scott?
Hey, my name's Scott Murphy. I also am at the University of California, Berkeley National Laboratory. I work strictly with the facilities group. So understanding kind of the programmatic framework, I install programmatic framework and identify things like safety issues and potential emergencies that can be written into process or procedures to kind of circumnavigate or identify the risk early and then have a kind of a plan to approach them through. So I'm looking forward to this, and thank you.
Great, the whole proactive risk reduction thing sounds groovy. Sarah, welcome, Sarah.
Oh, hi, thank you for having me. I'm afraid I'm coming to you from our local pool because it's 8 o'clock in the morning here and my little girl is having a swimming lesson. So sorry about the background noise. I'm a professor of sociology at University of Canberra, and I've been fortunate enough to work with Jan Hayes and Andrew Hopkins for the last, I'm going to say 13 or so years. I had a postdoc with Andrew and Jan after I finished my PhD. My particular interest is in professional decision making, I guess. Sorry, I just saw a chat thing up. I thought it was saying that my microphone wasn't working. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so I'm interested in professional knowledge and decision making and applying that in various domains, one of which is in engineering and risk management.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us today. And we empathize with the multitasking. Let's see, Esfandiar, welcome Esfandiar. We're doing self-introductions.
Hey, good afternoon. It's Esfandiar Imani and affiliate with CCRM, currently with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So happy to be here.
And you may or may not have worked for PG&E in the past.
I have.
Yeah. All right, so Nick's microphone wasn't working, but he's with USDOT and interested in individual and organizational risk assessment and management. And last but not least, my friend Peter Martelli.
Thanks, Trent. Peter Martelli, I'm an associate professor of healthcare administration at Suffolk University in Boston. Focus on healthcare and that domain, but have worked, I'm a longtime member of CCRM and a former director with Carlene, and have worked in oil and gas and electric and nuclear and whatever. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thanks. So what I'm going to do now is let's see, first, did I get everybody? I think I got everybody. Is there someone who did not do a self-introduction? The list is long. I've got to like scroll through it. Okay, hearing nothing. What I'll do is present a quick overview of the center, and then I'll introduce our speaker today, Professor Hayes. And then during the presentation, Jan, do you want people to kind of just raise their hand and ask questions, or do you want them to hold them to the end or put them in the chat? Do you have a preference?
I'm happy for people to jump in. I usually use Teams rather than Zoom, so I'm not too sure. But if I was doing this in Teams, I wouldn't be able to see people's hands go up once I start presenting. So I will kind of pause as I go along. And if people want to jump in, maybe that's okay. Okay, great. And I believe with Zoom, I'm all over, sometimes Teams, sometimes Zoom, but I think you see the hand. Okay. Yeah. So, all right. Well, in Teams, once you're in presenter mode with PowerPoint, you can't see the messages coming from the video package, but we'll see how we go. That's why Zoom I'm happy for people to, right. I'm happy for people to jump in when they have thoughts, and I'll try and remember to pause as we go along. Sounds great. And then, yeah, if you don't have a question, probably put yourself on mute. And then we'll get going. So before we begin here, the Center for Catastrophic Risk Management is a global multidisciplinary group of researchers from academia, government, and industry focused on developing pragmatic solutions to better manage the messy, complex, multi-jurisdictional problems of the 21st century. The group was founded in 2005 in the wake of Hurricane Katrina to conduct fundamental empirical research on the management of catastrophic risk in a wide range of settings. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker,
Professor Jan Hayes is a sociologist with 35 years experience in safety and risk management. She's a program leader for the social science safety research activities of the Future Fuels Cooperative Research Center and a board safety assurance advisor in Air Services Australia. Professor Hayes is a former member of the advisory board of the National Offshore Petroleum Safety and Environmental Management Authority. The Research Council of Norway contributed to her research funding, and her research interests are all connected to organizational accident preventions, including professionalism, expertise, decision-making, and use of standards. Professor Hayes holds a Bachelor of Engineering, a Master's of Business, and a Ph.D. in Sociology from the Australian National University. And with that, I will turn it over to Jan.
Thanks, Rowan. So let me share the slides. And it worked the first time, so hopefully you can now see my slides. Great. Okay, so thanks very much to Roon and to CCRM for having us along and for shifting your normal presentation time. The world being what it is, we see your presentations, but they're normally at 3 in the morning for us. So thanks for moving to the afternoon, which means it's now early Thursday morning here. You've heard from my co-author, Sarah Maslin, who's on the line. I should also mention specifically Paul Schulman. Paul introduced us to the case that I'm going to talk about. And we've had several very interesting discussions with him about the content. So Paul's name is kind of penciled in here as an author as well. Although I guess we take responsibility rather than him at this point. We're going to talk to you about PG&E. You will gather if you've read the blurb about today. So I'm not sure if we're brave or stupid to be talking to a Californian audience about PG&E from the other side of the world. But nevertheless, we think this is a really interesting case, and we've had a lot of fun looking at it in some detail. So before I get started, this is a kind of standard thing for meetings here in Australia. I should do an acknowledgement of country, and RMIT University, which is my institution, acknowledges the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. We also respectfully acknowledge ancestors and elders, past and present. We also acknowledge traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. So first of all, just a bit of background to the case that we're talking about. As we see it, there's a very strong focus within safety research about how culture drives worker behaviour. And the accident causation literature broadly tends to contrast a kind of individual normative view of behaviour where workers are seen as lazy, careless or incompetent, and that's why they make mistakes, with broad cultural explanations of why people make mistakes, why errors exist within organisations, cultural explanations based on characteristics such as what is rewarded. And there's kind of quite a large gap between these two kinds of explanations. And why the PG&E locate and mark case was attractive to us is that it gives us an opportunity to study culture at a micro scale using a kind of relational sociological approach, which is the kind of research that Sarah and I really enjoy doing. And we think it throws a really interesting light on some of these kinds of problems. So a little bit of background about PG&E. You're probably more familiar with this than I am. There are a range of utility companies in California, but PG&E is you know, the biggie. And as the name suggests, they provide both gas and electricity to consumers in California, and headquartered within California. So the case that we're going to talk about today is a problem that PG&E had with what's called locate and mark. So to take a few steps back, the most common cause of gas pipeline failure is damage by third parties. So all this infrastructure is buried under our streets, and the most common cause of failure of gas pipelines isn't engineering related causes. Some of you might be familiar with the San Bruno disaster there, which is not too far from you, and that did have an engineering cause of the actual pipeline leak itself. But that's relatively unusual. Most times that gas pipelines fail, or gas infrastructure, it's because of third parties coming along, digging in the streets and failing the infrastructure. So before people come along and dig out in public places, there's a requirement to use what's called the one call system. In other words, to ring a number or lodge a request online and effectively try and find out what infrastructure might be impacted by the work that you're planning to do. There's a requirement under Californian legislation that when these kinds of inquiries come into PG&E, they're required to do what's called locate and mark. So locate the infrastructure and literally mark it on the pavement, as you see in the picture on the left there, within 2 days of them being advised by some person with an excavator out there wanting to dig up the road. They're required to respond to these types of requests within 2 days. And the performance against that criteria of notifying within 2 days or responding within 2 days, the performance is reported to the regulator. Now, I've kind of simplified things slightly here and said the regulator is CPUC. The regulator is actually PHMSA, which is part of the Department of Transport, but it's contracted out to CPUC. So for the purposes of our discussion today, it's really CPUC that we're interested in. So PG&E incorrectly reported their performance of this locate and mark system over nearly a decade from 2009. So the data that they were reporting to CPUC was fundamentally incorrect. When this was discovered, the original settlement that was agreed between CPUC and PG&E in 2019 was 65 million by way of a fine, and this was increased on appeal in 2020 to $110 million fine for tens of thousands of late tickets going unacknowledged. These requests for information are called tickets. And the CPUC said, as part of the determination around this, each failure of PG&E to respond to one of these requests in a timely fashion increased the risk of another catastrophic gas incident. So they're clearly referring here to San Bruno and the potential for a failure to respond to this to cause another gas disaster. So our research question was, how did the process of false reporting to CPUC regarding locate and mark, how did this develop and how did it become established within the organisation? How was this justified? And of course, what are the broader implications for management of safety behaviours? So I'm now going to go into a bit of theory about lying within organisations and lying generally. So first of all, what is a lie? So I think we all know that generally speaking in society, honesty is seen as a moral virtue, so lies are morally wrong. But actually, as soon as you scrape the surface and start thinking about this, social acceptance of lies is actually quite complex, as we'll get into. The working definition of a lie that we've adopted here following some work by Barnes is a lie is a statement intended to deceive a dupe about the state of the world. And you might think that's pretty obvious, but there's a couple of subtleties to it. So unknowingly passing on untruths isn't lying. Intent is the key under this definition. And also, it doesn't matter whether the dupe is fooled or whether the dupe, knows that this is a lie. Again, it comes back to the intent on the part of the person providing the information. But what we see is that acceptability of lying is actually driven by the social context. Some researchers divide lies into benevolent versus malicious. So that's a kind of, simplified division. And what we're doing here in this research is taking a sociological rather than moral view of lies and deception. So in some work contexts, lying is acceptable or actually even encouraged. In the organisational studies literature, there are cases such as police officers lying to learn about criminal activity. There's also another interesting paper we found about carers lying to dementia patients to avoid unnecessary distress. In the service industries, lying is sometimes called benevolent dishonesty, and for some companies, their entire business model is built on deception. So you might think here of an example such as a virtual reception service firm, where the person who calls in is deceived about the location of the person answering the call. They're not really in the organisation at all. So this is in addition to the normal social context of lying, the white lies we tell just to rub along. So Jenkins and Delbridge go as far as to say that deception is actually a central characteristic of work, and it's certainly common that there are conditions at work where lying occurs routinely. And Jenkins and Delbridge came up with a framework about lying. So here is their kind of taxonomy. We've got 4 different types of lies that we can think about here. First of all, principled lies are those where the motivation is upholding some kind of moral code and we're lying to protect others from harm. Okay. A second type of lies are those defensive lies, and these are the ones that mediate power relationships where you're trying to protect individuals and cope with conflict or avoid conflict by pretending that something is true when it isn't, perhaps, but all about power. There are certainly also malicious lies. This is where someone lies to gain advantage over others by disadvantaging them, climbing over others in the organisational heap to try and advance oneself. And somewhat similar to that, but somewhat different as well, is the case of material lies, where people lie for personal or corporate gain. And this is about enhancing financial rewards or concealing damaging information. It could be the way a motivation of greed plays out by lying to try and gain from it. So Jenkins and Delbridge's work also emphasises that telling lies is a state. It's not a trait of any given individual. So there's no point in looking for the people who lie or seeing liars and non-liars as a useful distinction. So despite these many examples, lying is often cast as unethical or even a precursor to corruption. And clearly in the context of management of major accident risk, where every small failure can be seen as a gift, a window into the state of the system and how to improve it, lying is highly undesirable. So lying is all around us at work, even if we don't acknowledge it. And perhaps the more interesting question is, how does lying spread and become entrenched? How does it become a cultural norm in a particular organisation or group of people? One explanation comes from psychology. There's something called prospect theory that some of you might be aware of. And prospect theory tells us that once you start lying, you will lie to cover up that lie. So once lying starts, it can be very hard to change course. A second mechanism whereby lies develop momentum relates to how they're rationalised, and moral disengagement theory, as I have here on the slide, explains this. So Bandura and colleagues came up with this taxonomy of 8 psychosocial mechanisms that allow people to lie without experiencing psychological distress. The first of these is moral justification, in other words, giving the behaviour a moral purpose. So this is similar to the first kind of lie in the Jenkins taxonomy I showed you previously. The second psychosocial mechanism to make you feel better if you lie is euphemistic labelling. So in other words, using language that masks the ethical problem. Another mechanism is advantageous comparison. So saying, well, everyone does it, or worse. So the fact that I'm lying isn't really a problem in a relativistic sense. The fourth one is displacement of responsibility. So this is saying I'm only lying because others made me do it. It wasn't my choice. I had to do it. And similar to that, also related to responsibility, is diffusing the responsibility. So it wasn't just me, it was actually all of us that were lying. Another one is about disregarding or distorting the consequences. And this is really important when it comes to safety-related contexts. So this is kind of making the argument that this lying isn't so bad really, because the consequences are in fact not that serious. Something else linked to consequences is downgrading the value of the lie by dehumanizing those who are impacted. And the last one is attribution of blame. So saying that we were provoked, it's not my fault, we were provoked into doing this. So there we go. There's some reasons why people might continue to lie and how things might spread. Another interesting body of theory on this is Schulman, not Paul's work, and that's not a typo, a different Schulman, who's written about social loopholes. And again, this is, well, now we're moving more towards lying in that sort of organisational or social context rather than just as individuals. This work says that there's a tendency to move responsibility for lying from oneself to others via a range of social loopholes, which create for any individual an illusion of legitimacy. And there's an interesting quote here that comes out in the literature from an Enron executive who said, when giving evidence, you know, after the collapse, you did it once and it smelled bad. You did it again, it didn't smell as bad. So there's a kind of getting used to it thing. And deceit in organisations binds the group together, and those who refuse to engage often leave. The other interesting corollary of this kind of theory is that it emphasises that lies, in fact, lying across organisations takes some time to develop. So we think that's interesting too in relation to the PG&E case. So that's a very quick run through some of the theory that we've been looking at in relation to the case. In looking at the case, we've relied on publicly available documents from the CPUC website, primarily three very large documents. The CPUC Safety and Enforcement Division investigation report. Also, there's a show cause order that was issued by CPUC and PG&E's response to it. All right, so before we get into the details of what those documents say, it's worth remembering, possibly again, many of you are more familiar with this than I am, but remembering what was going on with PG&E before and during the period where these problems were occurring in their locate and mark management. So PG&E were declared bankrupt in 2001 as a result of financial difficulties to do with privatisation of energy supply in California. That was settled in 2004. The new CEO who came in at that point had a philosophy of faster, better and more cost-effective that was put in place as a management philosophy and through restructuring of the organisation. And just as an aside, some of you might, if you're familiar with that, you've seen it before in relation to NASA and space shuttle problems. In this same kind of time frame, the Californian government was making a push for increased use of renewables, which was occupying PG&E's senior management substantially, to the point where there was a kind of joke within the organisation that PG&E had a big E and only a little g. It was the electricity side of the business that really had senior management attention. Nevertheless, things were changing on the gas side as well as part of the organisational restructures that was going on under better, faster and more cost-effective. External consultants came in and looked at what was going on in the gas division, and the reported low rate of gas leaks that were going on at the time meant that there was a recommendation made that PG&E was spending too much on gas system maintenance, and so maintenance cuts were made. This was in fact not correct. There was an incentive scheme in place that really gave people an incentive not to report gas leaks. So the actual gas leak rate is thought to have been substantially higher than the official statistics that were available. So those maintenance cuts were made on a false premise. A couple of years later, there was a gas leak that killed a householder in 2008. That's the so-called Rancho Cordoba case, if people have been following PG&E. And of course, there was the San Bruno gas pipeline rupture in 2010 that killed 8 people. So at the time, again, following those, there's a major investigation and prosecution mounted. So PG&E senior management are obviously very focused on that. But things are still going on in the electricity division. The move to renewables continues. They're focused on that. And at about this time, there was also an increased focus on wildfire risk due to the poor state of the electricity assets and climate change making fire more of an issue. And only a few years later, the Camp Fire case came up in 2018, started by fallen power lines, which caused so much death and disaster. And the legal aftermath of that meant that PG&E was declared bankrupt again in early 2019. So it's a very fraught corporate history. And this is the background to what was going on with the organisation at the time these locate and mark things were happening. So in addition to all these things that were distracting senior management, many of their employees were still just trying to make sure that gas and electricity kept flowing to the consumers of California. So with that as background, what was going on with managing locate and mark? To give you an idea of the size of the task in managing this, there were 600,000 tickets received by PG&E in 2012, rising to nearly 1 million, over around 900,000 by 2016. So this is a massive task, responding to each of these inquiries within 2 days. So unsurprisingly, even back in the noughties, there was a database for managing this, and the software that was in place in 2009 to deal with all of these tickets and bring them in and manage responses had an error in it. And no one can tell at this point whether this was a deliberate design feature or an oversight, but simply opening a record in the database marked it as having been actioned. So this is the origin of the lie that grew up in later years. At the time, this was known to be a problem with the software. An internal audit noted that the 99% on-time response rate that was being reported automatically out of this software was not reliable because of this software design feature that simply opening the record said that the job was done. So new software was introduced in 2012, which fixed that problem. However, there was a procedure in place that allowed PG&E locators, which is the name of the people doing this work, it allowed the locators to call the excavator who'd lodged the ticket to reschedule. So effectively, you had to contact them and you could reschedule so that your response would be longer than 2 days. Your response in terms of going out and doing the locate and mark in the field. But what happened was that in many cases, a voicemail message was left for the excavator. The excavator never bothered to reply to them. The fact that the voicemail message was left meant that the person on the PG&E end marked this ticket as complete, and then the excavator went ahead and did the work with no marking on the ground. So again, the system's being kind of defeated, but in a slightly more sophisticated way than in 2009. It's also pertinent to note at this point that employee bonuses at this point in time were based on a low late ticket rate. So the locators had a very strong incentive to mark things off as being finished, even when they weren't. A 2017 audit within PG&E identified this issue and claimed that it was common knowledge. And at that point, the bonus arrangement was changed to be based on the number of damage incidents that occurred rather than a low late ticket rate. So that's effectively a summary of how things were managed with locate and mark over those years. And perhaps looking at this, you can start to see how lies arose and what kind of lies they might have been. So first of all, we've got this initial thing with the software glitch. We don't know for sure. Someone might have done this deliberately, but no one knows. So if we'll give them that one and say, okay, that wasn't a lie, right? We didn't deliberately set out to produce false response rate data. It came out of the way the software was designed by, some kind of accidental misunderstanding. However, once those 99% response rates are being reported in the system, then what grows up in later years is perhaps a material lie, where people are lying to say that that response rate is being maintained because they were given an incentive to do that by the bonus arrangements. So how was this being reported to management? The number of late tickets was part of what was called a key to success. There was a monthly management report called Keys to Success, and the number of late tickets was on that document. And the data reported was benchmarked against previous years in that reporting. So, for example, in 2015, it was listed in this kind of reporting that there were 3,385 late tickets and 99.4% on-time response. And that's quite astonishing. When you go back to those figures, I don't have a number for how many tickets there were in 2015, but it's around 600,000 or 700,000 tickets coming in, and only 3,000 of them didn't meet the requirements. My goodness, those people are fabulous, aren't they? And against this steeply rising number of tickets, the number of late tickets in 2016 was reported as being 44. Effectively 100% on-time response to the tickets. And this is in the face of an increasing number of tickets. So the number of tickets was on this monthly management report as well. And no extra resources were required, to deal with this increasing number of tickets. I know it's easy to say in hindsight, but even the slightest degree of questioning of this data would have revealed that it just can't possibly be true. So before we look at what the different attitudes were towards this, it's worth having a slight pause to think about, well, does this actually really matter? And in 2014, a backhoe driver damaged a gas line, causing $50,000 worth of damage. And CPUC were involved and investigated this. And what happened in this case was the backhoe driver had lodged a ticket. PG&E had left a message for the driver to call them, but as he didn't actually hear from them again, he assumed that there were no gas assets nearby and did the work without calling them back and damaged the line. So this was only a low pressure distribution line. So, small line, low pressure. It still caused $50,000 worth of damage. The worst possible case, which luckily, thank goodness, touch wood, didn't happen, was, there are high pressure transmission pipelines out there under the suburbs, as we see in the San Bruno case. And if someone had been excavating over a high pressure line and managed to damage it because of poor response from the locate and mark system, it could indeed have been a much more major catastrophe, but was not, thank goodness. So let's go back to who knew what and when. So the 2017 audit found emails in the system, internal emails within PG&E, going back years, discussing this problem and highlighting the lack of resources. So locators were regularly discussing with their supervisors that this was a problem and that something should be done about it. And in those emails, it was regularly reported that people thought the on-time response rate was actually around about 60%, not 99% as the computer system was reporting, and that the reason for the lower rate of on-time responses was directly lack of resources. They just couldn't do the work. This was also noted in a number of other places within PG&E's kind of management system reporting. So the fact that this was a problem was mentioned in operations reports. It came out in QC reports and internal audits. It was mentioned in various risk assessments that had been done about this system. And there were customer complaints coming in that, that people hadn't heard back within the 2 days. So there are a number of places within PG&E's system that this was coming up, if only someone had been looking for this information and been prepared to do something about it. Supervisors were told that they should tell locators to stop gaming the system. So people above the level of supervisors into middle management knew this was a problem, and their answer to that was simply to tell the locators to do their job properly and stop gaming the system. On the other hand, at the same time, those middle managers were pressuring supervisors and the locators who work for them to reduce the rate to 0. So even as the number of tickets increases, people are being told to report the data accurately, but also to reduce the rate to 0. So what we have here is the makings of a defensive lie, effectively. People are, on the one hand, being told not to lie, but then they're also being told that they have to achieve a certain level of performance that's just impossible to do. So if we look more closely at whether or not the locators thought this was okay, when you look at the text of the emails that were circulating within the organisation in this kind of time frame, many of them are using quite strong language about this. They're talking about the need to game the system and how this needs to stop. They're talking about faking of data and how, again, they're left with no choice, but this needs to stop, and that just stamping the box needs to stop. So some of the emails are using quite strong language. But also some people are being more euphemistic about it and generally wanting to use softer language. So at one point someone says, well, I don't know if I'd use the term falsify. What I'm saying is, well, inappropriately document. So that's what was going on in terms of them circulating this and discussing it amongst themselves and their supervisors. But at the same time, you've got this pressure coming down from above where they're told that no violation of the 48-hour rule would be tolerated. People felt under pressure to lose their jobs or be fired, be reprimanded. We don't want to get any late tickets. We don't want to be on the report. And this was noted as creating a really high level of fear in the groups within the teams that they wouldn't let tickets go late. Other signs of distress include the fact that there's quite a high turnover in this part of the organisation. Again, thinking back to the theory about lying, some people just could not buy into this and wouldn't stay in this part of the organisation. And ultimately, it was uncovered by whistleblowers reporting this to the regulator, in fact, to the Department of Transport. So the locators as a group were not happy, and yet this continued for many years. So what was going on with PG&E management? It's interesting to think about how they viewed this. We don't have their words directly from the time during which this was occurring, but what we do have is PG&E management's response to the show cause order. And that document is a really beautiful example of all kinds of language that allows moral disengagement. So they talked about, they did acknowledge that there were some inaccuracies in the data, which you might call euphemistic labelling. They talked about inappropriate choices having been made by some individuals who are no longer with the company. So the implication being there that those individuals were responsible for the lying and they're no longer here. So displacing responsibility. And also there's an undertone of we were duped, and if we'd known, you know, it was a case of bad apples. The PG&E response also noted that hiding the real rate by the lower level staff people was counterproductive, as if they had understood that resourcing was a problem, then they might have done something about it, but they didn't know it was a problem because nobody told them. They also noted that the management focus on safety, in other words, emphasising the call response and literally thumping the table over the rate of on-time responses. So this is a management focus on safety, had these unintended consequences. So again, it's not really management's fault. It's really those workers who, you know, we were just trying to get them to do the right thing, that it had unintended consequences. Management also make the argument that this actually doesn't matter, that the rate of on-time responses or late responses doesn't matter because the damage rate overall declined over the period. So that classic of discounting the consequences, it actually doesn't matter. So there you go. That's essentially the data we have around the case. So thinking a bit more theoretically about what was going on here, we have the lie being born from the software error, and then we have a range of things going on in the organisation about how the lie becomes established. We've got the incentive arrangements, the aggressive leadership style, and also a lack of link to safety. So thinking about those things in a little more detail, I think we can say this is definitely not a case of just a few bad apples. This was quite widespread. And this is a perverse effect of bonus arrangements. So the outcome of the software system, the outputs of the software system have established this expectation that the performance is close to 100%, and then continuing that becomes incentivized via performance bonuses. And this is a mechanism that we've seen at play in other major disasters. One that springs to mind is the BP Texas City disaster, where the analysis of the organisational circumstances following that claimed that the executive at BP didn't attend to process safety management because every incentive and potential penalty they faced told them not to. And the same could be said for the Gulf of Mexico blowout. Our colleague Andrew Hopkins has done an analysis of that accident, which brings the same kind of mechanism to light. And this is what we see, we think, at work within PG&E. So over the years, the esteem with which locate and mark personnel were held by the organisation, and at times their remuneration, were directly linked to the on-time response to locate and mark inquiries. If we then think about this aggressive leadership style, workers are being bullied to meet an unachievable outcome, and remembering that the real on-time performance was probably around 60%, meaning that literally hundreds and thousands of tickets were not responded to. There's no way the team could make this up just by working harder. And this we think is prospect theory in action, where the cost of admitting that the reported performance is not true is just too high. So the false reports continue. And it's also interesting to think that this metric exists, one assumes, ultimately in the service of safety, and yet this seems to have been lost. So the 2014 case with the backhoe that I mentioned before is bad enough, but this practice could have led to another San Bruno, as I've already mentioned. So in the case of rare events, like a strike that results in a full-bore pipeline rupture, there's so many layers of protection in place that workers can routinely bypass individual risk controls, like the locate and mark system, without witnessing negative effects. And so, culturally, this bypassing of the control becomes the way we do things around here, that classic culture description. The function of the control and its importance is then diminished over time. And also, this is time, obviously, when learning from experience is problematic. And another link to theory here is that what's required is what Pigeon and O'Leary would call a safety imagination that links the activities at hand to the possible adverse outcomes. So ultimately, the lie was justified, and there's a strong theme through all of this that people claiming it's a system issue. So it is interesting to think here about the structures in place that are supporting this kind of status quo. In the literature, in fact, in the safety literature in particular, there's a common assumption that corporate misbehaviour starts at the top, but there's a body of research that suggests that interaction between management and workers is important as well, that lies start with workers and responsibilities is displaced upwards and reinforced over time. So this displacement of responsibility is one mechanism that allows individuals to locate responsibility outside themselves and locate upwards to management responsibility for whatever morally questionable actions that they're taking. And there are a couple of studies in the org studies literature that we found that show workers will displace responsibility for unethical decisions upwards to unethical leaders, thus allowing them to make such choices without feeling guilty about it. But in both cases, it took more than 3 years for such behaviours to develop. So we see something similar happening at PG&E. The lie that the locate and mark performance complies with regulation originates at a working level, but PG&E senior management had several reasons for wanting to believe what they were told on this subject. As described earlier, the organisation was in a substantial state of flux and under significant pressure from several external sources. Restructuring following bankruptcy, the ongoing pressure regarding gas safety, but not linked to locate and mark, further restructuring regarding renewables, a major focus on wildfire risk and prosecutions related to serious accidents in both the gas and electricity divisions. It's also worth considering that the long-term adversarial regulatory relationship between PG&E and the CPUC made it difficult for PG&E officials to admit that their locate and mark system was not up to scratch. And in addition to various ongoing investigations in place at the time, the relationship between PG&E and CPUC could directly impact the company's ability to increase resourcing. I'm assuming some of you, but maybe not everybody, is familiar with the way that gas pricing works for an organisation like PG&E. The gas price charged to Californian consumers is subject to economic regulation, which is also administered by CPUC. So it's highly unlikely that the Commission, with a preoccupation on keeping cost to consumers low, would have approved any gas sales price increase, which would have been needed to support the additional staffing resources needed to comply with the 2-day rule. Yeah. So overall, what do we see here? What are the implications for culture and managing safety in other organisations? So what we see is that once established, social norms are hard to change. I mean, that's kind of a given for those of us with a social science background, but it's something that the literature on safety often doesn't acknowledge. So in particular, incentive schemes and forcefully expressed management priorities can create these undesired results. But the key lesson from this case, for me anyway, is that these impacts can last years beyond the life of the scheme. So we've seen many cases in the literature of perverse consequences of incentive schemes, but there seems to be a broad assumption that once you remove that incentive and change the scheme, that the behaviour will stop. But this case says that's actually not the case, that the behaviour is likely to continue. So to address that, it's got to be safe for people to discuss bad practice, or there's no moving forward. So there's a whole literature here about just culture that I'm sure many of you are aware of, but there's a particular link here, I think, between perverse outcomes of incentive schemes and the need for some kind of retribution after that to resolve these situations. The other message from this is the need to consider construction and reinforcement of culture over very long temporal timescales. I've worked with organisations in previous lives as a consultant where, you know, there's a Gantt chart with a milestone that says culture change. I mean, this suggests that that kind of thinking is highly misguided and that there are long temporal timescales involved here. Also, there's a reminder that areas of high turnover might be hiding problems. Not everybody at PG&E would buy into this kind of behaviour, and there was a significant turnover of staff in this area. And also, I'm sure we could spend more time talking about the implications for regulators in uncovering such behaviours. They're going to be very, very difficult to spot, and it's going to require significant regulatory resources to do that. So that's what I have of the PG&E locate and mark case. And thank you so much for listening.
Jan, this is Scott. I just wanted to say you hit everything so on the head. It was unbelievable. You came from there. I worked there from 2014 to 2016 in locate and mark, and immediately was like, I am not doing this, and I quit. I got my Lean Six Sigma black belt, and then was hired by University of California, Berkeley at the National Laboratory. Because everything you said, I was like reliving my worst nightmare. Like you were saying, I was like, this is unbelievable. I'm sorry, I just realized my camera's not working here. I just wanted to let you know that that was so spot on. It was magnificent, and everything you said was, I was like I said, it's reliving a time 10 years ago that I wanted to forget, but it was so spot on and brilliant. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. And thank you also for not mentioning in the introductions that you'd worked in locate and mark.
No, I saw it and I was like, I'm not going to say a word. I was like, oh my gosh. But I just wanted to let you know, I think the presentation and the message that you conveyed is so spot on that it is, I mean, it's uncanny. It was so well. And then when you said something in there about zero, I was told by and I don't know how much of this I should say, because I was involved in a lot of the stuff and subpoenaed and other things, but I know that was a theme that they said. Zero is the only acceptable number. That was literally told to me. It was shocking. I was actually taken to a Giants game with some other people, and they told us like, hey, you guys are doing good as long as the number's zero. And at that moment, I was like, I need to find a new job. I can't do this, because there was all kinds of stuff, and I had worked in process before, and I kept bringing that up. I said, hey, having late things is not bad. It's actually good. It's telling us that we don't have enough people to perform the work. And I was told a couple times that, yeah, that's fine, but zero is the only acceptable number. So when you had that literal phrase in there, I was like, oh, that is so well done. But very, very good. I actually enjoyed that. I was at the edge of my seat listening to everything, because I was like, ooh, what's next? What else stuff is in there? So very, very well done.
Thanks, Scott. So do you have any insights? I mean, maybe we can't share, or maybe you're not able to share, but do you have any insights into why there was such a focus on zero rather than thinking about wanting to improve safety?
It's funny that you said it, and I liked where you started to go into it kind of became accepted. I was, the more I look at it, it's like it was already kind of getting by. So like, let's not mess with something that's working, and we can kind of say, hey, it's kind of working. The thing with the calls, to me, that was a red flag. I was like, wait a minute, the law says it's within this many days that it has to be marked. But then they were calling and saying, oh, well, we called them and we said they're going to mark half the job. And then we'll come back when they're at that point and we'll mark the rest of it. And it's like, well, we've already surpassed that 2 days. I don't understand why we're doing that. And there was questions that were raised in the program that they were using. They could go in there and they could literally say, and like you said, the 2009 program I wasn't aware of. I came in 2014, and I was there, I think, I want to say for 18 months total. And then that was the end for me. So the high turnover was absolutely spot on too. Myself, I mean, there was so much turnover at the time, because I think people got in there and you started to see kind of like something doesn't sit right with me. So it was the people that knew that were out, and I left and went into process improvement, because that was kind of what my motivating factor was. Like, hey, we have a process failure here. Like, there's no check and balance on this, and we're able to kind of operate in this kind of area, and it wasn't the right area. So that spurred me to go into process, and that's again then why I went in and I do process, and I do process architecture and things now in UC Berkeley, and I love it. But there was a breakdown of process. There was also a very they didn't want to notice that they didn't want to see the writing on the wall that was saying, hey, there's issues, because it was getting done, and because there was, like you said, there was very little issues. They had a group of, what were they called? I don't know exactly what they were. They were hired in, and they were like investigators, and they would investigate when there was issue, like if what they called it a dig-in. If you hit the electric or you hit the gas, it was called a dig-in. And at that point, they would send out an investigator, and the locator that located that would also go out to that area. They would both look at it. And oh, I'm sorry, Estefar, I saw your hand was up there. I didn't want to keep talking. I'm sorry. I was going to say, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I mean, finish your thought. Then.
Okay. And so they basically had these investigators go out with a locator, and they would then look at it and say, oh, well, technically he dug past the marks. I only marked to this section. And it's like, okay, technically he did that, but by law, we should have marked the entire job. Like, so they would have this weird at fault kind of argument. And then it would become very contentious between the two sides, because it's like, well, you said you're going to be here. I dug to this point. You said you're going to mark this. It's now Tuesday. You weren't out here Tuesday. You didn't dig past this. And it was really interesting what happened. But I think it was the availability to see improvement, but then also say, I can also kind of, I'm going to turn my blind eye because I know you're doing it and I know it's getting done, but we're not having issues. But it's also kind of now acceptable for that to happen. As long as it's out of sight, out of mind, we're not focusing on it. So yeah, that's, sorry, long drawn out answer to that, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo Scott's sentiment on the presentation. Fascinating. Thanks for doing this. I'm glad or people are looking at incidents like this and they just don't let it go because it provides a lot of insights to everyone. I don't think I ever, my career path crossed Scott's in PG&E. His was shorter there, but I was there longer, and I was was involved in many different functions, in financial modeling, renewable transactions, power contracts, trading. But actually, the last few years was in risk management, and I was brought in after the gas explosion in San Bruno, which was one of the main findings was like PG&E might have a good financial risk management, but they didn't have any operational risk management. So they set up the enterprise risk management, and they assigned, they charged separate operational risk management for gas operations, electric operations, all sorts of. So I was in the gas operation risk management. So everything you said, spot on again. A couple of things I want to add is one is PG&E, on average had like 22,000, 23,000 employees, 23,000 plus contractors. And there are a lot of really ethical and professional employees in that company, in all levels, right? Even in leadership. But, and I can't, say, well, how many percentage or any of that, I don't have that insight, right? But the one insight I have, the person, there were two individuals who were let go when that incident, Mark and Lockett, happened in the higher up. We got an email, these two person effective immediately, they're out of PG&E. And one of them was my immediate supervisor. And so I didn't know why, like they didn't explain why, right? And then later on, I kind of find out, and I was so upset. This is like, we already like in middle of wildfires and all the high turnovers. And, I had many good years in PG&E, but the last few years was turning toxic because of high turnovers, right? Of course, we didn't know all the insights, like, why all the high turnovers. And some of it might have been politics, some of it like, whatever it was. But so I was upset, not because they let him go or anything. It's just that this guy, just a couple months before, was, reviewing my performance and commenting on my performance. And that just sat so hard on me. And that for someone unethical, and it'd be so stupid to make that kind of, I mean, I'm glad you're doing this as a sociologist to see why people lie. And for me at that time, it's like, why would you do that? You had a good job. He had a good paying, higher up in senior management. Why would you risk that to like lie on this data? What kind of instant, right?
So hopefully our analysis has given you some insights or framework to think about this in different terms. So as I've kind of emphasized at the beginning, we're not trying to frame this in ethical terms and frame the people that lied as being unethical, but rather than to understand why this arose, you know, at all levels, and the kind of interplay between what was happening at a working level and happening in management that kept this in place for so long. And the other thing to bear in mind is that this kind of body of theory about lying in organizations emphasizes that this isn't a trait of individual people, it's a state that people can get into.
Yeah.
So, you know, maybe thinking about it in those terms is a different way of thinking about it, rather than thinking someone has, you know, behaved unethically and they're a bad person. That's not the kind of approach. We don't think that actually progresses our understanding of the case. And certainly, you know, that actively prevents generalization. The kind of bad apple way of looking at this, I think, sends you down the wrong path if you're trying to avoid this in other organizations.
No, I totally get that. But there's also that people make choices, right?
That's true. That's true. People make choices.
Like, you know, Scott, after 18 months, 60 months, he decided this is not a place for him to work. He left. After 25 years and after going that kind of toxic period, I said, and I left few years ahead of what I could have had a like full pension. I left. So I made choice. I said, I don't want to be part of this. So I left 4 years ago. And just again, luckily, I was picked up I was approached by LBL. So that's where I am. I'm so far having a great time here. So people they can make choices.
Right.
Yeah.
Could I say a thing or two? Hello?
Sure. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, so you did a great job with this case. And as you know, have been pretty familiar with it myself in relationships I've had periodically with the Public Utility Commission as a kind of an informal consultant. And so I actually wrote testimony for the Office of the Safety Advocate about this during the proceeding that raised issues here. And then it came back to visit again for me when I was invited to help as a kind of an informal consultant. The regulator, the PUC, which decided it wanted to start regulating for safety culture. And they wanted some advice. And the first thing I said was, trying to regulate safety culture is the Mount Everest of safety regulatory challenges. This is going to be something bigger than you know. And the more I thought about this, and I wanted to emphasize a couple of things. One, if they actually had a better, stronger safety culture, it's likely that more people would have refused to go along with this. There would have been peer pressure from other people not to do this. But the process of trying to establish a safety culture is such a large scale and contextualized issue. And so I had to write a letter to the commissioners saying, you've taken on this challenge, it's really great, but you live in a toxic environment as a regulator. The legislature has no respect for the expertise of the Public Utility Commission, and it intervenes directly in giving it regulatory requirements it knows it can't fulfill, like environmental justice regulation. It doesn't know how to do that. It gave it wildfire mitigation regulation, which it had no expertise in at all and ultimately had to give away. And it writes codes, regulatory codes that have to be supposedly enforced by the PUC, one of which was the locate and mark code requirement for a 2-day turnaround. They had no idea, the legislature, when they passed this, what the staffing issues were. They had no idea they were dealing with in 2012, 600,000 requests a year. So they had no idea what implication that would be on the utility to actually try to do this. And they took all of the discretion away from this, about this, in a sense, from the Public Utility Commission, which could have had a better sense of this. The Public Utility Commission, as you mentioned, has a history of an adversarial relationship with its utilities. Media in the state of California and legislative pressure requires that it have this, that it does not allow, they do not allow or tolerate collaborative regulatory undertakings. So imagine the challenge for safety culture in a framework like that. And so, therefore, that adversarial relationship meant that in some regulatory relationships between a utility and a regulator, if the utility found itself sinking under a code requirement that it had not the staff, the resources to do, they might have gone to the regulator and said, look, what's happening to us? You have to help us with this. Let's think of a way that we can maybe get the legislation changed in terms of the time frame, or if we put forward a rate increase to have the staff increases, which are going to be huge, that you will sort of support that. But they knew they couldn't go to the PUC, because if they did, it was going to be in the media. The fact that they were sinking under this would have been a media story that would have been taken up in the state. So you have to think, God, you know, in a situation like that, the larger context has a probabilistic impact online. And in a sense, I agree with you. You don't want to, it's not helpful to talk about personality or character failings as the answer to this. You have to think about that context, and maybe a way is to think, if you could have an index. Emery and I devised this separation between the idea of regulating for safety or regulating for reliability, I should say, and reliable regulation. If you could have an analysis of the framework for reliable regulation and the elements required for that, you would see that this case lived in an area where there was no framework for reliable regulation. And then you could say, okay, let's think about the implications of that. One of which is the probability of lying to cover up error when the costs of error are so extreme probably is going to go up significantly. And that is a risk. So then if you want to think about safety regulation, you have to think, wow, in a context like this, risk of lying as an issue in compounding safety problems is a real issue. So in a way, I think we need to think, you're starting to do this more creatively about how we would handle lying as an element in a larger explanatory framework, an analytic framework that could actually identify risk with respect to reliable regulation for safety.
That's really interesting, Paul. You've actually linked together for me two pieces of work that I've been doing that I hadn't really thought previously were closely linked together. I've just had a paper published in Law and Policy about the conflict between safety regulation and economic regulation, which is something else that we've studied in the Australian context. Here, they're different regulators. And what we've seen is that when gas utilities put up a rate case to the economic regulator that's based on what they're required to do under the safety regulations, that the economic regulator sometimes throws out some of the proposed capital expenditure.
That's right.
And so we've got these dueling regulatory regimes.
Right.
And it's been left to the corporations to actually work out how to reconcile that conflict. The individual regulators are either not interested or not effectively dealing with it. So we've got two regimes and it's impossible to comply with both.
That's right. So in a sense, I would say the probability of regulatory failure with respect to safety is pretty high in a situation like that.
So in the cases that we've seen in that case about this dueling regulation, it doesn't manifest as lying within an organisation in the way we've seen here at PG&E. It's where you've got submissions going to each of the regulators, and then the feedback coming to the organisation from the economic regulator, basically telling them they can't have the money or they can't charge rates to customers consistent with recovering the cost of safety-related expenditure that they're required to make. And so they're just kind of left in this quandary as to what to do next.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
So thanks very much for the presentation. It was extremely interesting, and to see it all the details there was fascinating. I couldn't help but think of a keynote that Ed Schein gave to the IAEA about 10 years ago, in which he describes a case of timeouts in a nuclear facility, and how they tried to create a timeout regime, but that the whole system was subverted, right? And then people weren't reporting them, and they were getting the message, hey, we're being measured against other departments, and they have fewer timeouts, and so you guys need to have fewer timeouts, and subverted the whole system, and so on. And ultimately he was aiming towards humble leadership, which is we think his book at the time, but along the way, what he was saying is that middle managers got trapped because they didn't encourage a climate of openness, because it wasn't part of their own managerial metrics, so people above them weren't holding them accountable for passing along the kinds of errors that they see. And in turn, he says that that's because the leaders weren't holding themselves accountable for a climate of openness. So I see sort of parallels here. The other thing that it got me thinking was that, okay, well, in your theoretical framing, you have a lie is something with intent, right? Mm-hmm. And so I kind of like the idea of this typology of prevarication or whatever, but it does occur to me that that if we think of a lie as an intent, is it a form of a violation? Should it be treated that way, or is it or should we think of the way that errors manifest and are passed up the chain as not just a violation, but there's also a way of typologizing that as well. So anyway, those are the two things that came to mind. But oh, I'm sorry, and one other thing, which is it's a great idea to look at clusters of turnover. I think that's one of the things that the regulators should be doing, perhaps, is look at cases like, Scott said, oh, I ran for the hills. Well, if you see a whole cluster of people doing that, maybe that's a good indication that something is amiss, whatever it may be. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter. I've read a lot of Ed Schein's work, but I don't think I know the piece that you're talking about. So anything you can do to help me find that would be great, because it sounds like we should be referencing it in the article that we're writing based on this work. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, on your second point about is a lie a form of violation? Yes, if you want to use that kind of error management language, I think you're right, it would be. My concern there, though, is that those kinds of typologies and error management tend to downplay the organizational subtleties of this, and I think that's where the real lessons come in here. So yeah, I've got no argument with it being a form of violation, but yeah. And yeah, maybe we should be emphasizing more strongly this idea of maybe regulators can look at clusters of turnover, because I imagine it's the same in the US. Certainly safety regulators here wouldn't have access to that data. It's not something they would go anywhere near. So, and it's hard data they could potentially ask for. Yeah. Just an interesting thought.
I wonder if you could use like LinkedIn or something like that to see, because it's like it's one of these cases where, yeah, everyone knew, right? It was like even on your slide, you had sort of an open secret, right? And I wonder if it's possible to to look at how many people are, on the job market or recently moved. There's some way to even automate it through LinkedIn and things like that.
Interesting. Thank you. Emery.
I thought that was a great presentation. Now I have to take my hat off as a ratepayer. I'm so angry, and put my hat on as a interest in organization. And you know this, but I think I feel I need to say this. I think the focus on the lie and the systemic nature of the lie, of creating and supporting lies, is an important point to make. But I think if I were in this hat of theory hat, I also see something here that this is proof positive that there was lying. This is proof positive that there was an error in regulation or in policy making. I mean, we can say, oh, and what that means is the policy implications is, oh, we could have gotten the resources in order to ensure 600,000, 900,000, 1.2 million in the future calls could be made. But no, that's not going to happen. Okay. I mean, I believe that is even less certain than the fact that this was originally regulatory error, and that the unobtrusive or obtrusive best measure is your case to show it was regulatory legislative error. Now, I mean, that's not very helpful, but I think it moves the argument beyond something I appreciate and you appreciate, is the systemic structure of the line. The system here is the fact, and this is not a new idea. Paul and I have been talking about it for a long time, is the notion that regulation is a set of dispersed functions beyond the regulator of record. In particular, the ability to correct and identify and correct for in real time regulatory error is the infrastructure's responsibility. Now, what you have here is a case of a failure, or if you will, an actual recognition of it, but without people talking about it. They lied about it. But again, I'm repeating what you already know. That would be my broader point.
Yeah. Well, again, you're linking it back to this other case that we've looked at of economic versus technical regulation here, where people were talking about it openly, and the economic regulator in particular just said, tough, it's up to you to manage it, to the companies. So thank you very much for your input. They're really useful thoughts and really useful feedback. A couple of people have also been in touch via email and other message forms. Some people are asking about access to the material. I've given Rune a copy of the slides, and we're more than happy to share that. We're in the throes of finalising a paper to submit to Safety Science about this case. So there will be something published about it, but it's at that stage, close to going to the journal for review. So we're probably not really, it's probably not really appropriate for us to circulate that paper right now, but certainly the slides, I'm more than happy for people to see them, or, get in touch if you've got other questions or interest. Sarah and I will also be at the 4S conference in Honolulu in a couple of weeks' time. I don't know if people from this audience are familiar with the Society for the Social Studies of Science, 4S, and their annual meeting is coming up in Honolulu. So if any of you are planning to go to that, please let us know, because we'll be there and presenting this work as part of an open panel that we have running about applied ethics in technoscience. So we've got, I think, 9 papers in total, of which this is one. So yeah, we'd love to see any of you there if it's an option for you. Rune, I'm just about done. Does it come back to you at this point? Or maybe Peter? I'm not sure if Rune's still on the line.
Yeah, it'll go to Peter if possible. I'm in a parking lot right now. For the people on the call, the slides will be posted on the event archive page. It should convert over tonight, I think. And then starting tomorrow, you'll have a link to the presentations.
Yeah, well, I
Rune,
think
so can I confirm something, Rune? I can see that this is being recorded. Is there access to the recording on the website too?
Yeah, we're going to have both the presentation and the recording.
Then
okay, well, I think Rune's already sort of informally closed it, but let me formally thank Jan and her colleagues for doing this work and presenting a very interesting set of findings. Our next CCRM meeting webinar will be on Wednesday, November 8th. That's at the usual time, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific Standard. It will be by Kenneth Arne Peterson Gold at Stavanger, and the title is Attenuating Risk into Disaster. So I hope if you have a chance, please go on the website and sign up. You can get the link the normal way, and I hope to see you all there. So thank you very much, and have a very nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you all. Thanks.
Thanks again, Jen.
Bye.
Peter, can you stop the recording?
I don't think I can do that here, but you can clip off the beginning and end, locally. I think it's saved.
Okay. Yeah, I will do that. Okay, thank you.
All right. Take care.